Welcome to Archetypal Stories. I'm Kevin Richard, and today we're exploring the age-old question, how does one defeat a giant? Across myths, fairy tales, and modern-day movies, we see this over and over again. The tiny figure facing a towering giant, and beneath the armor and clubs and monstrous size, these stories are really about us, and what we do when we're up against forces that feel way bigger than we are. Because in everyday life, we usually don't meet giants stomping across the hills, but we do meet bullies, abusers, oppressive systems, and regimes, or corporations or institutions that seem untouchable. Something in our outer world or inside our own psyche becomes inflated. It grows too large and powerful. It starts to dominate us. The Jungian analyst Marie-Louise von Franz, who spent her life studying fairy tales, once wrote that giants represent the brute, untamed power of nature, a psychological dynamism, mostly of an emotional character which is stronger than man. In other words, a giant is what it feels like when we're in the grip of a force, inner or outer, that is more powerful than we are. Although, symbolically, these figures are not necessarily evil per se, but their characteristics do lack a certain refinement in their development. They're often impulsive, indifferent to the damage they cause, more instinctual than reflective, and usually lacking in logos, meaning, reason, and discernment. They don't negotiate and they don't self-reflect. They just crush. But in older traditions, especially pre-Germanic ones, the ones born in myth as opposed to fairy tale and folklore, we find giants who are not easily fooled. Their power is immense and formidable enough to fight a god. We should not assume all giants are simple in nature. So the real question becomes, if such forces are so greater than we are, how do we deal with them? How do we respond when we're the small one and something huge has all the power? Across stories, three major archetypal strategies keep appearing. They're not the only ones, and sometimes they overlap, but they do give three different ways that the small ones might survive or even defeat a giant. I call these the David and Goliath approach, the Ruse Gambit approach, and the Enduring Trickster approach. Let's walk through each one of these, and we'll discover and talk about what they might mean for all of our lives. The David and Goliath approach. The first is the most famous, the heroic head-on confrontation. This is David stepping out onto the battlefield to face Goliath. No disguise or tricks, just a shepherd boy with a sling, standing in full view of an armored champion with the odds stacked against him. For this approach to work, several things usually have to line up. Extraordinary courage, the right tool or weapon for the job, skill and precision with that weapon, perfect timing and distance, and not just hitting the giant, but striking one specific vulnerable point that can actually bring it down. And to some degree, one needs good fortune, luck, or some divine or larger force. Think of Luke Skywalker with the perfect shot to blow up the Death Star. In the David story, the stone doesn't just bounce off Goliath's armor. It finds a tiny, unprotected spot on his forehead. The whole battle, maybe even the whole future of the people, hinges on that one shot. We love these stories because they're so inspiring. The powerless stand up. The giant falls. Justice wins in one unforgettable moment. But if we look a little deeper, myth is a bit more honest with us, because for every David who wins, there are countless other Davids in history who never made it into legend because they were crushed. They had the courage, but they didn't have the right tool, or the right timing, or the right opening, or the right kind of luck. And when you charge a giant directly without all of those things, the outcome is usually predictable. That's why there's the old political saying, if you're going to shoot at a king, make sure you kill him. In other words, don't provoke a giant lightly. If you choose the David and Goliath approach, you're staking everything on a single high-risk move. So this first archetype does tell us, yes, sometimes life does call us to stand up directly, publicly, and bravely. But it also reminds us that courage alone doesn't guarantee a good outcome. To defeat a giant this way, you need courage plus skill, timing, and a very real opening. The second strategy doesn't try to overpower the giant. It tries to outwit him. Let's call this the Ruse Gambit. It's a short-term deception, a clever trick, a sudden reversal that uses the giant's dullness, vanity, pride, or rigidity against him. It's the art of the quick con, the cunning lie, or the improbable bargain. But there's a catch. It only works with a particular kind of giant, the strong but dull-witted one, or at least the one who's blinded by pride or self-certainty. The ancients were pretty clear. You can't trick the truly wise giants, the godlike giants of old, who are both powerful and perceptive, and who see right through simple illusions. But the heavy, blundering types, the ones drunk on their own strength and status, they're very vulnerable to this type of trick. The giant has an advantage. He has physical strength, weapons, or official power, but he also has a blind spot, vanity, greed, rigid rules, or a craving for flattery, and the need to look invincible. The protagonist designs a gambit. Using that blind spot, the hero, or sometimes the trickster, creates a one-time leverage point, a trap, a bargain, a gift, or an offer that the giant can't resist. The Trojan horse is a classic example. The Greeks appealed to the Trojans' pride, offered what looked like a symbolic victory or a surrender, and hid the warriors inside the gift itself. The Trojans roll the horse inside their walls, and the thing they were flattered by becomes the instrument of their destruction. You see softer versions of this pattern in all kinds of tales. A seemingly helpless character flatters the giants, offers him a prize or a bargain, baits his ego or appetite, and then flips the situation. In one early version of Puss in Boots, the clever cat tricks the shape-shifting giant into turning himself into a mouse, just to prove he can. The moment the giant becomes small and harmless, Puss pounces and eats him. The giant is defeated not by strength, but by his own need to show off. Now, the Ruse Gambit can sometimes bring about a total victory, but very often it's temporary. It buys time, it gets you a crucial document, an escape route, or a confession, a crack in the armor. It's like making one really good move in chess. It doesn't automatically win you the whole game, but it is the move to set up future strategy. So the second archetype tells us that when facing a dull, arrogant, and rigid giant, sometimes a clever move is safer and more effective than a heroic charge. But you need to be very honest about which kind of giant you're dealing with. Try a simple ruse on a truly wise and ruthless power, and you may just provoke it. The third strategy appears when the first two simply aren't options. Sometimes the giant isn't just some enemy out there. The giant is one who already owns your home, controls your job, rules your country, or dominates the relationships you depend on. You cannot fight him directly without being destroyed, and you can't just run away, or at least not yet. You may often find that you're a captive in the giant's lair. There's no easy way out. Here, it's very dangerous to be what George Orwell called a thought criminal. The giant wants not just your obedience, but your mind. In these stories, especially fairy tales about captives or imprisoned maidens, a different pattern emerges. The captive pretends to submit. On the surface, they appear complicit, grateful, and loyal, but inside they become hidden tricksters. Over time, they study the giant's routines, observe his habits, moods, and rhythms, learn his vulnerabilities, blind spots, and tools, information, and courage. Outwardly, they might smile, flatter, and obey. Inwardly, they are waiting, not passively, but strategically. This isn't a single dramatic revolt. It's a slow, patient resistance. They wait for the right moment, the opening, when they can finally build enough knowledge and resource to not just escape, but sometimes break the giant's hold completely. If the timing's premature or too late, the results are disastrous. These giants are often very one-sided tricksters. They try to possess what they can't actually integrate in themselves. Beauty, innocence, creativity, a person's freedom, an entire nation's soul. And it's exactly this one-sidedness that creates their weakness. Many stories use the motif of the hidden chamber or the secret heart. Discovering this secret is both vital and dangerous. We see in these tales, like the giant without a heart, Bluebeard, Fitcher's bird, and Punchkin, where the captive, often a maiden of desire, slowly uncovers the truth and uses that knowledge to break free from a much larger, darker force. And we see modern-day versions of this pattern too. The Count of Monte Cristo, patiently gathering knowledge and resource while in prison, then slowly dismantling his enemy's power. Les Miserables, where grace, mercy, and endurance gradually undermines a rigid legalism embodied by Javert. The Handmaid's Tale, where small, hidden acts of defiance and secret networks build under the surface of a totalitarian system. Schindler's List, where a secret collaboration hides a deeper rescue mission. We find this in books like The Firm, The Hunger Games, Red Rising, and Rogue One, where characters live inside the system they oppose, learning its inner workings until they can finally strike. But sometimes the risk is simply too great. In a story like 1984, the giant's power is total, so invasive that no trick, no ruse, no patient endurance can succeed. Resistance is broken from the inside out. Here, the timing of revolt was completely off, and a price was paid. Those dark stories are important too. They remind us that not every giant can be defeated, and a cost of resisting certain powers can be everything. So, the third archetype teaches us that when we cannot fight and we cannot flee, patience itself becomes a weapon. Disguise, apparent compliance, and long-term planning are not cowardice. They may be the only realistic path to eventual freedom. So what do these three strategies actually show us? The David and Goliath approach, direct heroic confrontation; the Ruse Gambit approach, clever short-term reversal; the Enduring Trickster approach, patient hidden resistance from within. They're more than just narrative patterns. They're like maps for how humans have learned to respond to overwhelming powers, whether those are abusive people, coercive systems, or inner forces like compulsions, rage, or despair. And together, they whisper a few hard truths. Courage is essential, but not enough. Giants really are dangerous. If you throw a stone, you need to hit your mark. A brave but unprepared charge can be the fastest way to get destroyed. Cleverness can save you, but only with the right kind of giant. The Ruse Gambit works on the arrogant, rigid, and easily flattered giant, not the wise, paranoid, and deeply perceptive ones. With those, simple tricks will backfire. If you're a captive, patience and strategy are not a weakness. When you can't fight and you can't flee, waiting and watching and learning are forms of active resistance. Outward compliance can hide inner freedom and long-term intention. Myths and fairy tales in this light are not just old stories. They're psychological manuals for living under pressure, surviving domination, and sometimes, against all odds, transforming it. Most of us will never face a literal giant, but we will face a system, a person, or a part of ourselves that feels just as huge and just as impossible to move. When that happens, these stories remind us, you might be small, but you're not powerless. You might be afraid, but you're not without options. Even against giants, there are always different ways to see, to wait, to move, and sometimes to win. A final note when a giant defeats itself. There's one last thing I want to add. Sometimes you don't actually have to do anything dramatic at all. Sometimes the giant collapses upon its own weight. Psychologically, we might say the energy of an inflated power turns inward and feeds upon itself. When speaking of dark times, Carl Jung reminded us that, eventually and inevitably, the snake will bite its own tail, meaning everything encounters an ending and fate. Every inflated power, every giant, runs on borrowed time. Life moves in cycles. What grows too large for too long eventually encounters limits, often devouring itself. Corrupt regimes rot from the inside, lies pile up until they contradict each other, addictions hit a point where they can't be sustained, systems that deny reality eventually crash into it. This doesn't mean do nothing and hope for the best. This can be dangerous, but it is a reminder that no force is absolute or eternal. Even when we can't see how things could possibly change, something in the background is always moving. And when the conditions are right, something new can be born out of the wreckage of what seemed invincible. Thank you for watching the latest installment of Archetypal Stories. If you haven't done so, please hit subscribe, hit the like button, or share a comment. Who or what are the greatest giants in your life, and what is the best way to defeat that giant? As always, stay curious and treasure the fleeting moments.